So we conclude chapter 31 by looking at the final society at crossroads, which is Japan, as a result of the end of the Tokugawa shogunate and the beginnings of what we call the Meiji Restoration. All right, so again, kind of quick review. So remember that the shoguns run the country and the Tokugawas had been in charge for about, at this point, when we talk about 1850s, about 250 or so years after, fighting for control and ending civil wars within Japan, over the local, fightings between the daimyo lords, kind of, doing little civil wars in between different parts of the country. And so the shoguns, specifically led by the Tokugawas, had been trying to focus on essentially bringing stability and peace within Japan and limit outside influence, which they blamed for the excessive length of the civil wars that had been occurring within Japan. And so they had essentially banned most Europeans from entering the country, with the exception of a little bit of the Dutch, to allow them to have some sort of access and knowledge of the outside world, and limited outside trade of Asia, because most of their trade had been focused on China and the Koreas. So the shoguns run the country with the consent of the emperor, who didn't really do too much. They dominated the political, economic, and social lives, and so they had slowly allowed for some transformations within Japan. So there was a growing merchant class. It was a little more accepted than they were within China. There was still the focus on Confucian values, and again, fears of, the influence of outside countries and what they would do to the internal structure and stability within Japan itself. But by the 1850s, you have internal stress because there are a lot of debt that they are going into, especially internally, especially within the samurai and daimyo class to the merchant class. And there's also a lot of famines going on, again, because if you think physiological density, Japan, with a growing population, even though it's slowing down, does not have the resources available to feed a growing population, because, again, it just agriculturally cannot grow that much more on its land, which would be a continuing issue for them. So in 1853, the United States shows up, again, as a result of the Industrial Revolution and the steamships, with these massive ships, only 4 of them, in Edo Bay, or where Tokyo is now located, or Tokyo Bay. And essentially he says, hey, we want to trade with you, and we want to open up communications and have this be like a stopping port for ships, wayward passengers, people that need to stop and refuel, and then they'll be on their way, but also maybe conduct trade. And the Japanese do not want this. However, because of the cannons that they're being pointed at, the amount and the size of the ships, they know that they cannot contest with the might and power of the United States, and now realize they have fallen behind the 8 ball. They are now behind where Europe and the United States are militarily and economically, and this is that point. So that's why we talk about this being the opening of Japan. All right, so kind of here's the idea. Those aren't the black ships or the 4 major ships, but again, the idea of here's the American presence that is landing within, at that point, Edo or Tokyo, and then the idea of, bringing in cannons, and then the transformation that now begins within Japan, ending the 250 odd year reign of the Tokugawas. All right. So, and this will end due to the fact that they are now, again, they've fallen behind Europe and the United States, and there's also the fact that they no longer feel like they can protect and control Japan as they once had. So after a number of revolts, there's a uprising led by a number of the daimyos and samurai, now armed with European-style weapons, that defeats the armies of the shogun, and that again provides and proves that we need new leadership. All right, so that begins the Meiji Restoration, named after the young emperor known as Meiji, in the 1860s, 1850s, who will live up until about the beginning of World War I, that will oversee the industrialization of Japan in the next, 50-ish years, that will completely change the direction and course of Japan and history within East Asia. All right, so they form a new government, in many cases initially led by the samurai, but then a growing scholar bureaucracy that we see within China, but that has a lot more room for advancement. And so they begin to industrialize and modernize to become a world power and regain their sovereignty, because when the United States signs a treaty with Japan, it's similar to the extraterritoriality treaties that have been signed within the Ottoman Empire and also within China, as a result in China of the Opium Wars, where the Europeans have spheres of influence. They're essentially, their citizens can do whatever they want, and so Japan finds this obviously humiliating, as other countries around the world had felt the same. But Japan says we're going to build our way out of this so this doesn't happen and we can protect our Japanese way of life while also modernizing with Western style culture, values, and industry. So they send a lot of their students and officials to, pretty much into Europe and into the United States to learn Western ways and values. So for like, how do we build industry? How do we educate ourselves to be more competitive in the modern world? This sets up urbanization or continued urbanization and factory growth. But this has also been kind of already established by stuff that had already been occurring under the Tokugawas, who were trying to set up, Japanese protections or protections for the Japanese people and society and economy. So even though the Tokugawas don't get to see, the fruits of their protection pay off, they actually are one of the big reasons for everything that they had done previously sets up the success that Japan will have in comparison to the struggles that Russia, the Ottoman Empire, China, and other peoples around the world face when threatened with the changing powers of the Europeans and the United States. So some of the changes, the government becomes more centralized. So they take what power was left from the daimyos, essentially setting up like regional governors like you would, see in the United States with places like Minnesota, Wisconsin, the other 48 states. So that happens, and they put up, again, scholar bureaucrats, and again, take that power away from the daimyos. They strip the daimyos and the samurais of their ranks, their stipends, which actually ends up saving money for the Meiji, and their privileges. And so many of those people had already been in debt, again, due to, changes resulting out of the Tokugawa era, as the merchant class was becoming more and more wealthy and prominent and having more access to land. There was a new bureaucracy, again, similar to China with the civil service and merit systems, or merit-based systems, and a new military that was not based on the daimyos and the samurai, as they'd kind of essentially kicked out their roles previously mentioned there, and essentially have a European or Western-trained army with Western weapons, Western styles, and uniforms, and more based on volunteers and conscription from all the different classes of society, not just the elite samurai, again, wealthy nobility class. And there is obviously going to be some resistance to that we'll mention later on down the road. So they also create a new constitutional government. It has limited authority. They kind of create a legislative body similar to Britain's parliament with two houses, one that has more power than the other. But essentially, it's just there to advise the emperor and his, his cabinet and his prime minister. But essentially, they can't actually make laws without their approval. The emperor, at the end of the day, still controls the military, still controls the executive branch, and has a lot of say, depending on how much say they actually want to have. And some freedoms, and especially in political rights, are given to the lower classes. But again, you have to be a wealthy landowner or have to have so much wealth and property in order to actually be able to vote and be a member of these legislatures. So again, the book, I think, mentions around 5% of people or adult males in Japan could actually vote and participate in government, which is very lacking, obviously. But again, it's a much bigger step in the right direction, but it's also similar to the lack of centralized government changes, or similar to that, what we're seeing within Russia. But, again, step in a more democratic fashion, as they were saying, well, maybe democracy, or at least forms of democratic processes, is what has allowed Europe and the United States to get a big jump on the Industrial Revolution, which is partially true. Education reform, so that even though in terms of education before the Meiji Restoration, Japan was probably pretty far ahead of most countries. As about 45% of males had been educated, about 15% of females, which was pretty high for that time period of the world around the early and mid 1850s or 1800s. But then they focused completely on universal education to, again, ramp up their military production, ramp up their industrialization and competitiveness. And so that's primary and secondary education, beginning of universities, fields of agricultural studies and industrial production. So again, focusing on all these different areas to build up Japan and the Japanese economy. Now, with that being said, there's still heavy Japanese traditions that are involved in here. So there's still emphasis on Confucian values, respect for your elders, for the family, and also within Shintoism, about reverence for your ancestors, but also that the emperor is essentially a godlike being on the planet Earth. So that stuff still remains, and so that will obviously continue, especially through World War II. So that kind of helps to explain a lot of the characteristics and feelings and practices and values within Japanese society, which again, some of that is obviously borrowed from China. Education for girls is predominantly, while they are educated, is predominantly focused on domestic duties. So while there is some feminist movements at this point to get women more political rights, more social rights, it's similar to other parts of the world at this point. It doesn't really exist. It comes mainly from middle and upper class women who have those education and wealth, but again, not actually extended, right? So the economy, unlike where we talked about it, within Russia, where it's led by the aristocracy, here you have that merchant class that actually can play a role, but the government is still actually running the show, at least initially. They will set up pilot programs that then they will sell off to private business owners and private investors and merchants who can then run the industries. And they typically have to have pretty close government ties to begin with, so the wealthy get wealthy, essentially establishing an oligarchy in terms of who can run the economy. And so that's kind of where that begins. And while they're being advised by Europeans, the Europeans aren't actually being the ones investing in it. And so the Japanese are pretty much putting in their own money to bring over, advisors from other parts of the globe to help set up their economy. But it's the Japanese running the economy, running the actual businesses, the firms, the factories, the production is all being run and controlled by the Japanese, just maybe advised by Europeans. And most of the money that Japan is going to make is on textiles, and we'll talk more about that process and the effects of that. They reset their tax system, which, oddly enough, I found this very interesting, that their tax system up until the Meiji Restoration was based on grain. So you, as a farmer laborer, you had to essentially give the government grain, as part of your taxes instead of actual money, which I thought was very, very interesting. But this now changed the system over to taxing based on money and income. And so this actually focused more on agricultural production, that those who did not maximize their food production would actually end up losing their land or be more susceptible to losing their land to people who could be more efficient and more productive within growing their own crops. So similar to what we see here in a lot of Western countries nowadays, that if you cannot compete with your neighbor has the right to buy you out, and then you got to go move on. You got to work on another piece of land or find another type of job, maybe move to the city, things of that nature. And they're aided obviously also by state-run banks to support the increase in trade. They get rid of internal tariffs because, again, there was a lot of tariffs in between the daimyos to make themselves wealthy and increase the competitiveness. They get rid of that. Also, getting rid of guild restrictions. So again, to make more goods and restrict the rights of artisans at the expense of, again, selling more stuff for Japan to be more competitive on the global scale, and increase trade and travel within the country itself. So yeah, we will come back to this resistance to Meiji Restoration and reforms and the actual effects that the Meiji Restoration has in the next video.